The Nanjing Massacre of 1937 was a horrific event wherein Japanese soldiers invaded Nanjing and brutally looted, raped, and killed an estimated amount of 300,000 Chinese citizens. In order to honor the memory of this event, the Chinese government has built a memorial dedicated to this event. Esteemed guests, students, and teachers, we are Evian, Noah, Adrian, and Shay, students of the Shanghai American School. Today, we will be introducing our annex building for the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Museum. About a month ago, our team was presented with a driving question that asked us to consider how space and design could be used to influence the narrative of the Nanjing Massacre Museum. The first step of answering this question is by visiting the museum and learning facts and details of this horrendous event. After taking in the terrified statues of Chinese bolting away from their soldiers, the skeletons of the victims lying in pits, along with other graphic details of the event, we concluded a narrative for this controversial museum. The architects who created this museum were responding to Japanese authorities denying the existence of the Nanjing Massacre. As a result, the architects present overwhelming evidence that this incident did, in fact, occur, and the Chinese suffered greatly in a period called 100 Years of Humiliation. A side effect of this museum is that they also instills Chinese nationalism and hatred towards the Japanese, which is very apparent in the epilogue. It states, "We should not forget that small and weak nations will always be bullied and invaded by powerful nations, and under the inspiration of the patriotic enthusiasm, we should struggle unceasingly for the construction of socialism with Chinese characteristics." We feel that Chinese authorities influenced the construction of the memorial and are using this incident as an excuse to build self-defense mechanisms and evoke strong feelings of nationalism.
During our visit, we noticed that the museum tried to encourage feelings of hatred towards the Japanese from mainly the Chinese audience by using derogatory terms in its captions and by showing graphic displays of violence. In our opinion, the current museum focuses too much on the past and the atrocities that were committed, and stirs up feelings of antagonism towards the Japanese. While this may help the Chinese government by creating feelings of nationalism, we felt like this did not benefit either the Chinese or the Japanese in the process of accepting and processing this event. Resentment towards an entire group of people is the root cause between major massacres, such as the Holocaust, and the Nanjing Massacre itself. By turning the Chinese against the Japanese, the memorial does not encourage peace, and instead increases the chance of violence in the future. Because of this, we have created an annex building with the goal of helping the Chinese people come to terms with and ultimately forgive what happened during the Nanjing Massacre.
The main aspect we wanted to emphasize in our museum was man's ability to choose the higher road and be the bigger person, despite all the times he has been wronged for in the past. We believe that no matter the circumstance, man will always have the capacity to forgive others for their actions and choose to consciously allow themselves to let go of their hatred and move on past the event, instead of punishing the generations after by continuing the cycle of hatred. Like Viktor Frankl said in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, our greatest freedom is the freedom to choose our attitude. Our annex building is not meant to force the audience to forgive, but rather create an awareness that forgiveness is an option instead of hatred that was instilled in them by the previous museum. Our museum consists of two main buildings, connected by an underground tunnel. Our design is influenced by a prominent Chinese symbol, the lotus flower. In Chinese culture, especially Buddhism, the lotus flower represents purity and forgiveness. It is highly valued in Chinese culture due to the fact that despite its muddy growing environment, it still manages to bloom above the water, clean and pure. We felt like this represented Chinese and their process of forgiving, as we hope they are able to overcome dark events in their past and emerge with a clearer mind. The exterior for our design for the main building has a darker color palette, to match the negative tone the audience has towards Japanese after going through the old museum. Firstly, there are lines of trees that lead to the entrance, creating three different paths that combine to one. This represents the originally different beliefs that the Chinese and Japanese have towards each other, but with mutual help, we can combine efforts and work together towards a greater future. The roof of our museum has various skylights, inspired by lotus roots, From the interior, the sun will flit in through the skylights and resemble light seen from underwater to represent that at this point, the audience's mind is still in a state of darkness.
As the audience walks into a museum, they are met with a hallway going forward and two walls. For the people who do not want to forgive the Japanese, we give them a choice to walk straight through and exit the building. However, the hallway progressively gets narrower and narrower to encourage the audience to turn left or right instead of going straight through and educate themselves about the history behind this event. We believe that giving the audience a choice gives them a feeling of strength and empowerment should they choose to see and hear the Japanese side and possibly forgive. The main glass walkway splits 3 walls apart. This building tells the parallel stories of a Japanese soldier compared to an ordinary Chinese citizen during the time period of the Nanjing Massacre. Each wall represents a different stage of their lives leading up to the massacre. Showing how the Japanese people had lives as well humanizes them and shows the Chinese that they too are people, inspiring forgiveness. The purpose of this is to represent how their childhood diverged and what caused the Japanese soldiers to act so brutally. Besides that, a main cause of the Nanjing Massacre is the indoctrination that the Japanese soldiers went through as they grew up. The Japanese government created a culture of hatred toward the Chinese by dehumanizing them and brainwashing the Japanese soldiers to believe that the Chinese were lesser beings. As children, the Japanese schools and military camps heavily enforced the idea that the Chinese were below human beings, to the point that the Japanese were punished with beatings for believing otherwise. Although this does not justify the actions of the Japanese soldiers, we feel like it would be helpful if the Chinese actually understood that the Japanese had reasons for their actions, and that they were, in their own right, victims. We hope that providing something the audience can emphasize with, the audience will be more likely to forgive. If we look at the walls as a whole, it forms the Chinese character Wang. Wang translates to a king or emperor, although that is not the case nowadays. We use this to further represent the divide of the Japanese and the Chinese, but that is only because of the suppressing regimes of the past. Focusing in on each wall, there are progressively more falling lotus leaf indents in the wall, to symbolize the increasingly dark life of both the Chinese citizen and the Japanese soldier as they grow up. Likewise, the wall color also deepens as the audience progresses through the glass hallway. Furthermore, all our lights are hanging to further represent lotus roots and the unforgiving mindset the audience still has. At the end of the hallway, the audience moves down a ramp into an underground tunnel. In this underground tunnel, we will have displays of Japanese soldiers apologizing for what they did and their own individual stories. Several Japanese soldiers have expressed their regrets for their actions, including Iwane Matsui, one of the military commanders for the troops that plundered Nanjing. Stories allow human beings to empathize with others and makes their apology seem genuine and personal.
We do this in an attempt to humanize the Japanese soldiers, so the audience knows that they too are humans, and that some are sorry for their actions. Lastly, the audience moves up a wheelchair-accessible ramp into a large white building in the shape of a blooming flower. This room is dedicated to creating feelings of forgiveness and acceptance in the audience, which is why its brightness and tone is a direct contrast to the buildings before it. In this room, we have a lotus flower placed in the middle, surrounded by lights. In this room, the lotus flower is in full bloom. This symbolizes how the guests are entering a new stage in their understanding, as in the earlier rooms they were still growing. On the walls, there were various quotes emphasizing the importance of forgiving. There is also the word forgive in various languages pasted on the walls to make it universal and applicable to everyone. The walls of the exterior are shaped using a contrast of materials to create shapes that resemble petals that wrap around the building. Lastly, at night, the various LED lights in the interior will light up the entire mostly glass building and will glow to create a beacon of light for the city of Nanjing. LED lights are the most energy efficient form of lighting. This type of light is used from clocks to a TV screen to a traffic light. LED is lit up by the movement of electrons in a semiconductor substance. When activated, LED doesn't get particularly hot, which saves energy as opposed to having it wasted on heat. They also are very durable, lasting longer than almost all standard bulbs, up to 20 years. Altogether, this is a very energy efficient light. Furthermore, we will close the lights at 7 o'clock to reduce energy usage.
One of the main concerns with our world right now is climate change. Climate change is caused by an abundance of CO2 emissions that are released into our atmosphere and is damaging our environment. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change refers to limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. At the rate that carbon dioxide is being outputted right now, we will not meet the goal. In order to help China meet the COP21 requirements that were issued during the Paris 2016 conference, we have chosen specific materials to reduce energy loss. By limiting the amount of energy loss, less energy will need to be produced, which means less CO2 will be released as a result of energy production. Energy transfer and loss is done in 3 ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the direct transfer of energy from vibrating atoms and happens when the objects are touching. When an atom is in contact with thermal energy, it becomes excited. This means that the electrons of the atoms will jump to a higher energy state. The excited atoms will vibrate, rotate, and translate more rapidly, and more collisions will happen due to collision theory. This will result in the transfer of thermal energy from one atom to the next. Convection happens because when atoms become excited due to heat, the atoms collide more, which means that there is more space between each atom. Because of this, hot air is less dense, so it flows up, while cool air sinks. This warm air eventually cools down because the atoms cannot retain their high energy state for that long of time and sinks back down. This creates a cycle of rotating air that spreads the heat around. Lastly, radiation happens when different particles collide with one another. When that happens, particle A's kinetic energy is transferred to particle B. Particle B's electrons move up energy levels and store the energy gained from particle A as potential energy. Then, the electron will eventually move back to its original state. If a particle emits a photon whose wavelengths and frequencies are in the infrared section of the EMS spectrum, this will cause heat radiation. Our 2 buildings will have vacuum-insulated panels. Vacuum-insulated panels have a high R value of 30 to 50, which means that there's higher insulation. The vacuums created by the panels majorly decrease energy loss by convection, as convection relies on the movement of gas molecules in air to transfer heat. It also reduces heat loss by convection because air is a poor insulator of heat. With a vacuum, this transfer does not happen. Although we do use glass, the glass will be triple pane, as triple pane in glass creates a vacuum that achieves effects similar to the vacuum-insulated panels. The glass is also low E insulated, which means that it will reflect radiation to prevent heat loss through that. In our tunnel, we will have insulating concrete forms, which are layers of concrete poured between insulating material. This means that our tunnel will be more resistant to energy loss through conduction while still retaining a high level of stability.
In conclusion, our annex buildings to the Nanjing Massacre Museum communicates that no matter how skewed in the circumstance, there will always be a choice that can benefit both parties. The first annex building symbolizes the rift of the 2 countries due to their past, and the second building represents the countries can rise above the occasion, like a lotus flower. Hope you enjoyed our narrative and buildings to the Nanjing Massacre Museum. And once again, we are Evian, Noah, Adrian, and Shay.